Thank you for joining the AssistRx Patient Solutions Blueprint, Product Lifecycle Action Plan and Assessment Strategies webinar. My name is Jan Nielsen, and I'm the Division President of Patient Solutions at AssistRx.
Hi, my name is Kevin Robbins, and I'm the Vice President of Business Development within AssistRx.
In this three-part webinar series, we will talk about how to tailor your patient support program for your brand stage in its life cycle, how to measure program performance, and empower your teams with actionable insights and best practices for program transitions, regardless of your brand stage in its life cycle. In today's webinar, part one of the series, we will talk about the evolving needs of providers and patients throughout the brand's life cycle, and how the perfect combination of tech and talent can serve these populations. So first, we'll jump into the life cycle of the brands. Kevin, why don't you kick it off?
So thank you, Jan. I'd like to start off with talking about the early stage of a brand's life cycle. Within the early stage, which I like to call brand awareness, is a cycle of educating both your provider practices as well as payers about the product. It can be educating them on the reimbursement codes as well as the services that are available for a brand. We're going to tackle some of the technology components that flow into this. If there's a miscellaneous code that has been assigned to your product, it's not only the appropriate code, but how it needs to be documented within your systems. Some of the traditional electronic solutions that would be helpful, such as EPAs and real-time benefit checks, may not be as valuable at the brand awareness stage or the initial stage of your product coming to the market. It's not that you don't want to offer EPA solutions and opportunities to streamline process. There is different ways that you can integrate those solutions and make them available to your practices, as well as within your back-end patient service components that Jan will talk about a little later. You do want to make them available, but you also want to educate them on the values. Integrating things like prescribing information, as well as appropriate clinical instructions, as well as information that's specific to your product, that will help educate payers on the appropriate, not only patient demographic, but pieces that will flow into their policy and their coverage decision is very important. Those can be integrated and presented directly to your providers. At the mid-life cycle of your product, it contains both not only brand awareness, but you're transitioning into brand loyalty, where once they've decided that this is appropriate for your patients, now there may be a billing code. Maybe there now is prior authorization components that are specific to your brand on the market, as well as policies integrated within each of your payers. You want to educate them not only out in the field, but within your technology solutions. You present those components to them as they evolve and as the information is available so that they can see those components and streamline their processes. And then you transition into brand loyalty, where maybe adherence and persistency is a bigger challenge than your reimbursement, where you can take some of the nursing components and have those in the front line of your solutions, where they can not only request them, but automate some of those processes and make them available to both your patients and your providers. The key to these technology solutions is to make them available at the right time so that you don't frustrate either your patients or your providers. Jan, do you want to talk a little bit more about some of the patient solutions in each of these cycles of supporting a brand?
Great, thank you. So in addition to rolling out services that make sense for the brand in its stage of the life cycle, you also need to be thinking about contingency planning. I've built 4 homes in my lifetime, and I do think that my next home is going to be built perfectly, right? No, there are always things you need to think about as you build your home, just as you need to think about when you build your program. As I build a home, the permits may not come in on time. Your FDA approval may not happen as you thought. You may hit a natural spring as you build out your foundation when putting in a pool, or you may hit a RIMS requirement as you roll out your particular program. You have to plan for plan A, but I'm also suggesting very strongly plan B and plan C. Now, another avenue to walk down for just a moment, I cannot tell you how often I hear from a manufacturer, oh, I've launched blah, blah, blah number of drugs. I've handled generics. So I know that specialty is the same as generics, right? And I'll just send it through retail, and the physicians will learn to write script that way. There's a lot of nuances in the environment. And so I encourage you to take a moment to reflect. Do you really understand the market dynamics? Do you understand the various prescriber workflows that are writing your script? Do you understand the patient and the caregiver populations, the role of the specialty pharmacies, and the level of sophistication that are in each of those specialty pharmacies, as well as the sophistication level in the practice? Are you first in the market, or are you number 14 in the market? How will that affect your required service offerings and educational outreach? There are very, very different strategies that need to be considered depending on your position in the market. When you talk about early life cycle for a first-to-market drug, you should be educating the market by reaching out to the patient advocacy groups, is my suggestion. Educating providers, second. Payers and specialty pharmacies, and then trying to understand all the other nuances that the touch points will be facing or interacting with within the workflows. If you're 14th to market, you often are not just repeating what your competitor's doing, but you're also looking for an opportunity to create some differentiator. Kevin, let's move on to the mid-cycle of the product.
With the mid-life cycle of the product, you need to consider not only what you're going to make available to your providers, but what you're going to make available to your patients. Is there pieces of an evolving copay program or an evolving PAP program that you want to make more patient-driven and provide them with the opportunity to notify the doctors of their requests? Those are pieces that can be both patient-facing in a screening process, but in a communication process. Through the technology solutions, that flow of information can go into your CRM and into a provider notification. It can be driven into what's traditionally called a provider portal, and you can drive things in the reverse direction. If a doctor thinks that the appropriate solution, whether it's copay or PAP, might be appropriate for their patient, some of those electronic communications that I highlighted earlier, such as secure emails where they can log in and sign off on certain services that might be appropriate to that patient. If there's documents that's required as part of your compliance to be enrolled into those programs, where those notifications can come directly from your patient service component. But if your doctor has been educated on the processes that are required within your patient services solutions, those can be driven directly from your doctor to your patient's messaging. And then your patient can log in, leverage secure components where there's an identity proofing that can be not only verified, but audited. And then they can upload the information through self-service features that reduces the level of effort of both your patient service components and expedites access to therapy. Those components where I talked about brand awareness become more and more self-service as those processes can be streamlined. Jan highlighted the very different aspects of a product, whether you're first to therapy or second to therapy, or maybe you're in a very competitive market where you are going to be the 12th or 13th, but you have something that differentiates you that you need to make sure that your providers and patients understand. Those can all be integrated into their solutions so that they understand the information that's important to get to insurances and obtain coverage. Historically, those have been driven through phone calls that are very manual and very time consuming. And we all know that offices suffer from things like call fatigue, that you might create a process and say, well, we're going to call them every Friday. But if you can design solutions that are integrated within their workflow so that they don't have to constantly tell you that we're going to call me Fridays at noon. Instead, there's automated communications that you can generate, their own reports, and things that fit naturally so that if they want to do it after hours on Thursday, that you can automate those communications or drive it into their preferred methods of interacting with your patients so it doesn't become a burden. The other components is to say that as you design these solutions, maybe the patient solution level becomes less and they want to go direct to SP more because of where they are in their life cycle and they understand the coverage components. And maybe they only need the wraparound services that you offer as part of your patient services solution. It's important to have flexible technology designs so that those components can be a la carte for your patients and your providers. So often when we design technology solutions, we focus on what's provider facing, but it's equally as important to say if you can streamline the quick start order, the bridge program, so that you're managing expectations with patient facing tools, that you can have that same level of sophistication presented to your patients in a very easy, non-sophisticated way. You want to select a service provider that has experience in designing that level of technology that makes it not a burden to leverage the technology, but supporting the patient on their path. Jen, would you like to talk more about the more adherence and end of the life cycle for a brand?
Absolutely. So as you move into that mid-life cycle and then forward from there, you should have a pretty good understanding of what's working, what's not working, what are the drop-off reasons. And so at those particular points, or just prior to a drop-off, for example, this is when we would like to suggest to you that you think about some adherence opportunities, things that you could do to help facilitate a patient staying on product as prescribed and not dropping off early. One of the things to be thinking about is there an opportunity to do a conversation with the patient, face-to-face or over the phone, or technology, doing a chat, using FaceTime. There's a lot of things that can be done in this environment to help a patient understand that there is a drop-off point or knowledge of some type of barrier that's going to be coming up, and how to help plan for whatever that barrier may be. Whether that is a side effect management issue, whether that's a fatigue and feeling a burden psychologically to the family and that their life really has lost meaning because they're not able to complete the things that they normally or what brings them joy. And then the other side of that could be a financial burden. Are they hitting a donut hole? Are there out-of-pocket expenses in a particular patient's life cycle? For example, all of a sudden having to take care of a grandchild or a daughter. So when you go into your reasons, it's really looking very broadly at what are the drop-off reasons, and then what are the things that you can do to help facilitate it from a patient perspective. The other is from a HC perspective. So when you look at that physician, why aren't the physicians continuing to write script? Is it because there's a heavy prior auth issue to deal with? Maybe even into an appeal support or lack of appeal support program? Is there clarification from what's happening within that payer environment so that those offices understand what's needed if they're going to continue, and how heavily a burden is that upon their office to continue? The other is in that buy and bill realm. Are the margins there for those organizations that are writing, those office practices that are writing for that script? Or the SP, are they underwater? And what's the issue there for them, so that you can really see and understand across the stakeholders what's occurring at this stage of the environment. There's a lot of opportunities to sit and plan for, and it takes the whole team and an effort to sit down and to walk through each of these concerns, first off with stakeholder scoring, looking at opportunities within e-support, and looking at the full length of time that it takes a patient to get on drug. And that's through from the time of the physician writing the script to the time that the reimbursement issues are addressed and there's actually a dispense, and then what follows once the patient starts taking the drug. So if we'll move further on, Kevin, let's talk about next steps here.
Now you may be asking yourself, based on our last slide, what type of technology should I use to get the fastest access to therapy and most accurate coverage outcomes for my patients and providers? We highlighted the importance of determining what technology to present based on where your product is in its life cycle. So I would say at launch, at a minimum, you do want a patient-facing resource that can obtain signatures. We all know that missing information is a big challenge within the patient service arena. So being able to, at a minimum, collect electronic consent is very important. But so is managing expectations of what that signature means. What types of reimbursement services are going to be available? It's more than just the signature, but are they going to receive a welcome call after that? Is there a welcome kit that will be auto-generated and sent from your non-commercial pharmacy? Is there an opt-in component, such as adherence and persistency service, regardless if it's managed by your patient services team, your specialty pharmacy, or maybe a separate vendor, setting expectations on what that experience will be if they're opting into the program. Some copay components or patient assistance components, it may be a little early at launch because you're still developing your market. But if every patient receives a quick start order, that's another piece that you may want to manage and set expectations. When we got into the second stage and we talked about maybe you no longer have a miscellaneous code and policies are starting to be drafted specific to your product or adjusted for the clinical components to prove medical necessity, then you can make more components available to your patients, such as managing copay assistance, such as now understanding what the coverage pieces look like. Any document upload features are valuable. And we talked a little bit about nursing. I know Jan covered that in an adherence and persistency standpoint, and I talked about it in some of the technology components. I would recommend a scheduler system, them understanding what the nurses can and can't do. If there's training components tied to that, or they're actually administering the therapy, you want to make sure you set those expectations up front. No one wants to sign off on something and not understand the level of service that they're going to receive. So it's easy to say, well, there's a bunch of HIPAA language that they're signing off for. And that may be all that's needed from a compliance standpoint, but you want to keep things very simple while the patient understands what they're signing for and what the value is for them. Now on the provider side, in the provider engagement components, you want to make available to them early on, if it's a retail benefit, the thought of them running their own electronic benefit check, where it's always going to have maybe an adverse outcome, especially if you have a miscellaneous code, is something that you may not consider at the early stage, but you would expect a high prior authorization volume. Those are things that you can make available up front. But as you start seeing coverage decisions and policies in place, maybe that's when you open up a real-time benefit check component to them so that they start building a brand confidence in your product. Not that they're always getting more of a step edit or a rejection code, but that they're getting the prior authorization details that can truly help them in their process. And I already referenced the nursing components and nursing services. I would recommend any electronic communications that while they're in the middle of enrolling your patient in your program, that can be triggered to a patient, that would be something that would be available to doctors throughout the life cycle of your brand. Whether initially it's only a consent email that they send, or there's other emails that they can send that request documents to be uploaded and recommendations to them. Those scripts that are sent from doctor to patient can be designed and approved by your compliance teams, automated into those emails, and you can create it so those emails do not have reply features and that they're one direction, and that the patient can have the phone numbers required that if they have questions about those communications, they can call into your patient services team that can help not only explain why they received the communications, but the value to them to help get them on therapy and keep them on therapy, and why their doctor would recommend your product and your services to them. Jan, was there anything that you would like to add in this component?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that were triggering in my mind. So when you look at technology, let's look at it through a couple of different lenses. So the patient support provider, for example, is your patient support provider able to utilize technology? Are they able to utilize it in a way that helps either put a hold or reduce the number of FTEs that are needed? Or are they coming back to you year after year and continuing to ramp up with additional FTE, additional people in the seats, for example, instead of using technology to help facilitate the increasing need over having a body sitting in seats? The other then is taking it out to the patient. Kevin was mentioning, the patient and provider sites that are available. For example, if you look at PAP, free drug, there's an incentive for patients to go and fill out information, go out to a site, whether it's a drug page, an advocacy group page that has a link to your PAP program. There are a number of reasons for a patient to drive to getting that free drug. So instead of having an individual talking to the patient, another headcount being added to help facilitate, answer questions, etc. Use technology to drive them to a PAP enrollment site. And then on the other side of that, for providers, this is an easy way for someone in the office to do it after hours, for example, on their lunch break, whatever it is that they're wanting to tap into for time management. Technology can help support that. And not only can you do that for PAP, but you can do that for copay enrollment and other e-support solutions that Kevin has mentioned. The other thing is being able to think about, in today's environment around natural disasters, is your technology available so that individuals can go from a call center in the office working site to an in the home environment? And can you still see the productivity levels? Can you still have calls recorded, both inbound and outbound? And what happens if you have a blend of those? Maybe your call center experiences an ice day or a hurricane. And so for short periods of time, can the staff be moved into very quickly a work from home environment versus long term? Or can it be split if they're split sites? These are things to be thinking about, again, in your contingency plans of plan A, B, and C.
And we also want to think of the business rules that can be established in these technologies. Nursing care, as an example of some of the injection training components that I talked about earlier, that more and more are being integrated through technology solutions. That can change throughout the life cycle of your brands. So in instances where maybe you want to set up stage gates for what patients have access to, and you want to make sure they follow a sequence before they speak to a live person, to Jan's point, where maybe it's a video initially, where you walk them through a video of how to use your product, how to self-administer your product. And then after that, you can ask them if they still have questions. And if they still have questions, maybe it's a video conference. Well, then a nurse comes on to your technology and walks them through the same components, but maybe has that training kit where they can walk them through both the use of the product, setup, and administration, or they schedule a nurse to come out and visit them at their homes. Those are the types of business rules and logics and vendor that you want to partner with that has experience of saying you can give them the option 1, 2, 3 up front, or set up business rules that triggers activities that make sense for where your brand is in the life cycle. And that concludes our first segment of evolving provider and patient needs throughout the brand life cycle. We'll be moving on to segment 2 of aligning technology and talent-enabled services within our next webinar. Thank you for joining us.